Dear students, let's have a short recap of the last few classes. We were discussing about sexual reproduction of flowering plants, where stamen and carpel were the male and female reproductive organs of the flower. The stamen pods enter, which is the fertile part, where a process called microsporogenesis takes place within microsporangia or pollen sac. And carpel bears ovule or megasporangia, where a process named megasporogenesis takes place. In both the process, due to meiosis, we get two spores, microspore and megaspore, and both these two types of spores are haploid in their chromosome number. Now, as these two spores are formed, that is the microspore and the megaspore, it leads to the development of the gametophyte of the flowering plants, which is the male gametophyte and the female gametophyte. Microspore itself is the male gametophyte, whereas megaspore itself is the female gametophyte. Microspore undergoes certain development and it forms two male gametes, and megaspore similarly undergoes development and it produces the embryo sac, which bears one egg cell along with some accessory cells. Now, the two male gametes, they are present inside the pollen grain, and the egg cell, it is present inside the embryo sac, which is within the ovule. Now, a process takes place here where the pollen grains that bears the two male gametes are transferred to the stigma, which is a part of the carpel of the flower. And this whole process of the transfer of the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma of either the same flower or of different flower of the same species is called as pollination. So in the last class, we discussed about the types of pollination and the various agencies that leads to pollination. So in today's class, we are going to discuss about the process of fertilization. Before the process of fertilization, an interaction takes place on the stigma of the flower, which is called as pollen-pistil interaction. Now let's see what is it. So we know that pollination, it is not a sure method, and the stigma, they may or may not receive the pollen from its own species or from different species. So the stigma, they generally rejects the pollen grains from other species, as well as they might also reject those which are incompatible with them, though they are from the same species. So that we have learned from cross-pollination. The stigma, it recognizes the right type of pollen through some chemical signaling process, and this chemical signaling process takes place through some chemical secretions between the pollen grain and the stigma, and this whole interaction is therefore called as pollen-pistil interaction. So here, as the pollen grain, they come and gets attached to the receptive part of the stigma, the pollen grain, they elongates in size because of the formation of the pollen tube. So that we have studied while discussing the post-pollination changes during the development of the male gametophyte. So now the pollen tube, they bears the male gamete, and this whole process is taking place within the ovule. So let's learn what is fertilization. In case of angiosperms or the flowering plants, the fertilization is called to be double fertilization. So let's know why. The term fertilization means the process of fusion of two gametes, that is the male gamete and the female gamete, is called as fertilization. So in case of angiosperms, the fertilization is called to be double fertilization. Now let's see what is the meaning of double fertilization. So in case of angiosperms, one of the male gamete fuse with the female gamete and the other male gamete fuse with the secondary nucleus. Since fertilization takes place twice, the process of fertilization is called double fertilization. So in case of double fertilization, generally two steps takes place. One, which is called as syngamy, and the next step, it is called as triple fusion. Now let's see what is syngamy. See, we know there are two male gametes that are formed from the generative nucleus in the pollen tube over the stigma of the flower. So when one of the male gamete, which is haploid, fuses with the female gamete, another haploid cell, to form the zygote, which is diploid, it is called syngamy. So when the male gamete actually fuses with the female gamete, that whole process, it is called as syngamy. And triple fusion. Now why it is called as triple fusion? When the other male gamete, which is haploid in its chromosome number, fuse with the secondary nucleus. Secondary nucleus, these were two polar nuclei which was present in the central portion of the embryo sac, which is diploid in its nature. Because of the fusion of two haploid nuclei, it becomes diploid. And when the other male gamete comes and fuses with the secondary nucleus, which is diploid, to form the primary endosperm nucleus. So the resultant cell here is the primary endosperm nucleus, which later gives rise to the nutritive tissue, which is called as endosperm. So that becomes thrice n haploid number from the male gamete and diploid number in the secondary nucleus. So n plus twice n, it becomes, the resultant cell becomes thrice n, and therefore this is called as triple fusion, since a triploid cell is formed out of the fusion. Here in the picture A, it represents the initial step of double fertilization, that is the pollen pistil interaction. And after pollen pistil interaction, the pollen tubes are formed, which comes through the style to the ovule, where the embryo sac is present. The embryo sac, it possesses 3 antipodal cell, 2 synoid cell, 1 egg cell, and 2 polar nuclei. So the pollen tube, it enters through the micropolar end, or it can enter through the clavicle end, and the male gamete, it reaches the female gamete. So as the male gamete, it reaches the female gamete, in diagram B, as you can see, the female gamete after fusion with the male gamete forms the zygote, and the synergid cells, they degenerates, whereas the antipodal cells towards the clavicle end also degenerates, and the 2 polar nuclei, which is termed as secondary nucleus or central cell, that gets transformed into the primary endosperm nucleus, and from the primary endosperm nucleus, it later develops the nutritive tissue that is present inside the seed, which is called as the endosperm. Now let's learn the significance of fertilization. Fertilization is a very important step in case of all the sexually reproducing organisms. Fertilization gives rise to zygote, which is the result of the fusion of male and a female gamete. So this zygote gradually transforms into embryo, which on germination forms the new seedling. The second importance is that the ovule, which is present inside the ovary, is transformed into seed, which protects the embryo and endosperm. So we have come to know that the ovule is transformed into seed after the process of fertilization, and we know that the seed bears the embryo, which bears the next generation plant. The third importance is that fertilization stimulates the development of ovary, which gradually transforms into fruits. So fertilization leads to the development of fruits from the development of the ovary. And lastly, fertilization helps to establish parental characters in the offspring. As we know that a male and a female gamete, it fuses during the act of fertilization. So in that it tries to establish the parental characteristics, which leads to the continuity of a race and thereby maintaining the diploid nature of the plant body. So these are the few significances of fertilization in case of an angiospermic plant. Now let's see about the post-fertilization changes. Actually, we have already discussed the post-fertilization changes in the significance of fertilization. So let's discuss the post-fertilization changes very briefly. The first post-fertilization change is the development of the endosperm from the primary endosperm nuclei which is triploid. Then the development of embryo from the diploid zygote, that is the next post-fertilization change. The third post-fertilization change is the development of the ovule into mature seeds. And the fourth post-fertilization changes is the development of ovary into fruits. So these are the post-fertilization changes, and in our next class we are going to discuss about the post-fertilization change in details. Thank you.